Hello and welcome. How can a modern, developed country appear to go bankrupt overnight? It's a question that has implications that go beyond geographical borders and challenges the way that neighbours do business. For Iceland, caught in an economic crisis brought on by the collapse of its major banks, the choices are tough. The most recent issue started when Landsbanki filed for bankruptcy after creating Icesave, a scheme which offered incredible, some would say unbelievable, returns to foreign depositors in the UK and the Netherlands. With the global economic downturn, the bank was unable to meet its commitments, causing it to fail and leaving its investors empty-handed. To protect its individual savers, the British and Dutch governments compensated those who lost money with Icesave, and now those countries want that money back from the government of Iceland. The controversial repayment plan amounts to more than $17,000 per Icelander and is set to go to a referendum in March. And although Iceland itself is not in bankruptcy, some say the terms of the repayment deal are so tough it could push the country over the edge. So on today's show we ask, what's at the root of Iceland's economic woes and how can it move forward without isolating itself within Europe? Joining me to examine the issues is one of the key people at the centre of that debate, the President of Iceland, Olafur Ragnar Grimsson. Mr. Grimsson has had a long and distinguished career in Icelandic politics and has largely had the backing of his people in questioning the demands of those countries looking for repayments of debts following the Icesave scandal. But will that mood of support sustain? Mr. President, thank you for your time.
Well, it's very nice to be with you.
Thank you, sir. On a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being mild and 10 being absolute disaster, where do you put Iceland's current situation?
I would put it somewhere in the middle at the moment. Of course, the final months of 2008 and the first half of 2009 was a difficult period, to put it mildly. We almost had a complete breakdown, not just in our economy, but also in our social fabric and severe political crisis. I think it demonstrated very strongly and dramatically how the financial sector can in fact threaten social stability and cohesion and the democratic foundations, because as you know, Iceland was and hopefully still is one of the most peaceful and cohesive societies in the world. And if a collapse in the financial sector can do that to my country, it's worth thinking about what it could do to the entire world. But then the nation came together. We have had 3 different cabinets during this period. We've had to have democratic elections. We've had to appoint special prosecutors as well. But we had inherent strength in many of the sectors based on our natural resources. So those have enabled us to come forward. So I hope that in the second half of this year, we will begin to see the country recovering again, little by little, hopefully also in harmony with what's happening in the rest of the world.
Well, you're sort of in a hanging position right now because you're due to hold a referendum in March on the second repayment bill that's been put forward to the public. They seem to be softening their approach. You had very much a strong support, 70-something%, in favour of your view, which is not repay until other issues have been sorted out. It's changing a little bit now. How do you expect that vote to go?
Well, with all due respect, it's not an accurate summary of my view. I mean, what happened, as you said so correctly, there are 2 different laws. One which we passed in August and I signed in September. And that is based on agreement we made at the end of last summer with Britain and the Netherlands. And there were certain preconditions which our parliament put forward. And the essence of those preconditions is that the repayments would not threaten the very survival of the Icelandic economy in, say, 10 years' time or so. The British and the Dutch were not very happy with that, so we had to pass what was called an amendment law, and it's that amendment law which is being put to a referendum. If there is a majority which says no, then we are back to the law, which was based on the agreement from last summer. But I think you are correct in saying that what has happened in Iceland in the last few weeks has made the British and the Dutch government realize that maybe they went too far, that there is a need to look at this again. And more people are realizing what an enormous scale this really is, because if you take the total sum which is at stake here, and you transform it into the British economy to get a comparable figure for the taxpayers in Britain, it would be equal to asking the British taxpayers to shoulder a burden of 700 billion pounds because of an operation of one British bank in two foreign countries. That's a formidable task.
Interesting, though, that Gordon Brown, the British Prime Minister, would take the action of declaring Iceland a terrorist state, of all things, to be able to freeze its assets in the UK. How did you react to that?
Well, the nation was deeply offended for primarily two reasons. First of all, it was an act which we have not yet understood. Why employ the terrorist legislation against one of the most peaceful countries in the world, a founding member of NATO, and classify Iceland, the Icelandic government, and the entire country formally on the official publication list of the British government, together with Al-Qaeda and Taliban. And if Gordon Brown had only the terrorist legislation to deal with Iceland, well, I must say he and the British legal system is in deep trouble. But he did even more. He then went on global television and said that Iceland was a bankrupt country, which was utter nonsense. You could even classify that as financial terrorism of a certain degree. But this meant, because people all over the world, business people, companies, entrepreneurs, took him at his word and thought, well, the British Prime Minister can't be speaking utter nonsense. So they closed down all dealings with all kinds of Icelandic companies, even if it had nothing to do with the banks. So in fact, these actions by Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling in the early days of October 2008 unfortunately made the economic crisis in Iceland much worse and deeper. But what was more, my nation was perhaps more deeply offended by that action of employing the terrorist legislation and classifying Iceland together with Al-Qaeda and Taliban, because we are very proud of our peaceful culture, where the president can walk around the street without any great security or anything of that sort. So maybe the nation was more offended by the cultural offense involved in such a decision than the financial damage, which was huge. So I can assure you, because my nation has a long memory, that Gordon Brown will be remembered in Iceland for centuries.
Now, let me ask you about the approach that Britain and the Netherlands took with Iceland compared with other countries such as Latvia. Is there a sense that that you were being picked on?
We were absolutely being picked on, and I found it kind of paradoxical that at the same time, with all due respect to the British Prime Minister, he was using this unilateral tough action against Iceland. He was walking on the world stage saying, let's all work together. Let's all now come together. Now I want to be a leader of a new type of global cooperation in the financial world. But when he was tested with respect to Iceland, it was tough action unilaterally against that small country, which, by the way, is a long-term ally of Britain and lost many lives during the Second World War because we provided a major part of the food to Britain during that period. So there was a certain paradox in that, but I hope now that we are in a dialogue with the British and the Dutch government where both they and us realize that it is possible to find a solution to this problem. Surprisingly, the people of Iceland, by and large, farmers, fishermen, teachers, nurses, and others, are willing to shoulder an increased tax burden, even because of the failure of this single bank, in order to create a harmonious relationship with other countries. But the question is the scale and the size of it. And about two-thirds of that sum, which I mentioned to you before, which would be 700 billion pounds within the British system. Two-thirds of that is a rate of interest, which the British and the Dutch government are demanding that we should pay them.
I think it works out about $17,000 US dollars per Icelander, equivalent of or something, isn't it?
Yeah, something like that. Depends sort of how you calculate it, because the end figure depends somewhat on the currency development. Right. As well as how much of the assets inside the failed bank will in fact be realized in the years to come.
Well, Mr. President, let me put a question, because our viewers, as you know, get a chance to ask some questions here. And we had one from a viewer by the name of Ehsan Butt, who sent in this through our Facebook page. He says, since all economies are interlinked and interdependent, we should conclude that the crisis of one economy is usually both self-inflicted and inflicted by global forces. Now, this essentially happened. What happened in Iceland was because of bank deregulation rules, and it makes me wonder, well, who's to blame then? I mean, you know, why would it be? Why wouldn't there be more of a responsibility on Iceland to have to think about what's happened in terms of its banking regulations?
We have taken great responsibility. And we are absolutely aware that the blame lies largely with ourselves and our institutions. May I remind you that we had to change the government. The previous government had to resign because of its failure in this instance. We reformed the central bank and changed the leadership both in the central bank and in the Financial Regulatory Authority. We have appointed a special commission headed by one of our Supreme Court justices to go into every detail of the collapse of the banking system. We have appointed special prosecutors to go into this, and even hired Eva Joly, who became very famous in prosecuting financial crimes in France very successfully. So we are doing our utmost to make people in our own country accountable for their mistakes. And by the way, I don't think there's any other country that has taken so extensive judicial procedures to deal with the aftermath and the responsibilities of the banking and the financial crisis. But that doesn't change the fact that there was also a responsibility, both within European institutions and elsewhere. Like President Obama said in a famous speech, we now live in a world where a failure in Florida has a big impact on Iceland. But also, the Icelandic banks were operating within the European financial framework, because we are an integral part of that market through the European Economic Area. But what became evident in our case, that whereas there was a pan-European financial market, there are not European regulatory agencies. When we are reconstructing the global financial system, one of the lessons that can be learned from the Icelandic experience is that we cannot, in the long run, have regional or global financial markets unless we are willing to strengthen the powers of regional and international regulatory agencies.
I think this is something that the French President Sarkozy has also been very much emphasizing here.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, you know, that we find ourselves more in agreement with France on this issue than perhaps Britain. And may I remind you also that the French Central Bank said a few years ago that the guarantee funds that each country was supposed to establish, and as we did, would not cover and should not cover a collapse in an entire banking system. So that is why many of our distinguished lawyers, experts in European law, are arguing that the legal responsibility with respect to the Icesave debt does not lie just with Iceland, but also lies in a joint way, both with Britain and the Netherlands and others. And thereby, what happened to my country is a clear demonstration that we now live in such an interconnected world that we have to create institutions and regulatory framework to deal with this. Because what was the Icesave phenomenon? I'm not sure whether your listeners really understand it. It was an internet banking system, and now the combination of the global financial system and the information technology and the integrated European market means that a head of a bank can sit in Reykjavik one morning, get the idea to let his computer guys in the basement create this internet program for banking, announce it the next week without really opening an office in any other country, and start banking in Britain and the Netherlands very effectively and freely, offering higher rates of interest and so on. And our formal institutions have not yet discovered tools to deal with this phenomenal combination of information technology and the globalization of the financial markets.
So an interconnected world with interconnected problems now. We're going to ask you to hold that thought, Mr. President. We're going to take a short break here. I'm back with more on this discussion when we return. Don't go away. Welcome back. Iceland is in something of a political and economic stalemate following the collapse of its banking sector and large outstanding debts to countries such as Britain and the Netherlands. The battle over how and when to pay the debt has put our guest in a particularly difficult situation as the country's president. We're talking with Olafur Ragnar Grimsson. Let's get back to that discussion. I guess one thing thing that's come out of this whole issue is that there's also the human greed factor, because what was being offered in the IceSave scheme was interest rates that were way beyond what most people could expect. And I think, wasn't human greed a big factor here, people rushing in to put their money in?
No, it certainly was. And that is what some people have been arguing with respect to those in Britain and the Netherlands who say we want our money back, that they should have realized that by entering into these accounts with higher rate of interest, there were also a higher risk factor. And we have had statements from various individuals as well as representatives of agencies that were putting their money into various accounts, that they decided not to put them into the IceSave account because of the high risk. So it's not simply a situation where you can take all kinds of risk with your money, and if you fail, you send the bill back to the taxpayers. And I think also what is at stake here in the IceSave issue is simply this. What happened was that greedy, irresponsible bankers used the eagerness for higher interest rate of others, greedy people, to establish this network of banking. If now the end result is that the bill for failure can be sent to the taxpayers in Iceland, nurses, teachers, fishermen, doctors, pensioners, professionals, it is a signal to the banking community in the years to come that you can take risks, you can play around, and in the end, you're not responsible. You can send the bill back to the taxpayers. And there I come to what I think is a very important part of this global debate, and perhaps comes forward in a nutshell in the referendum in my country. Our legacy in the Western world is based on two pillars. One is the evolution of the free market economy, but the other, which we sometimes tend to forget, is the development of democracy, which fundamentally is based on the will of the people, not formal framework for governmental agencies, but on the will of the people. What happened in the last 20 or 30 years? Well, the market became paramount, and the financial markets became supreme. Democratic control and the will of the people was somehow sidelined. But now, when the system fails, suddenly the financial institutions and some governments want to bring the people back as taxpayers, but not as decision makers. But what we are trying to do in my country through the referendum is to redress the balance and bring democracy forward and base the ultimate decision on what has been called, since the establishment of the United States on the Bill of Rights and the great constitutions in the French Republic, on the will of the people.
Does that mean, to some degree, there's pressure, though, with the discussions taking place to try to resolve this, that the pressure is off the kind of gridlock that seemed to be appearing, with Iceland being threatened by Britain and the Netherlands as far as its IMF loan being blocked, as far as accession to the European Union, and in fact, presumably, if Iceland doesn't get into the EU, there's also more damage in the long run in terms of recovery and growth.
Well, that is being debated. There are pluses and minuses in EU membership. One of the advantages now for us is that we have been able to devalue the currency. So that's one of the reasons why the economy is gaining strength again, is that the export sectors, fishery, energy, IT, technology, has in fact paradoxically been doing better since, because of the devaluation. But the negotiations with the European Union will take 2 or 3 years, and hopefully this dispute with Britain and the Netherlands will be over by then. But I say this again, the European Union was not simply created for the purpose of an integrated European market. It was also created because the European nations wanted the form of government and human rights to prevail instead of the wars that had characterized the European continent in the past. And similarly, the IMF was based on the Bretton Woods system, which was inspired by democracy after the Second World War. Therefore, we find it paradoxical that the IMF is not coming forward with the second stage of the loans, even if Iceland has outperformed on all the criteria that were put forward, simply because de facto Britain and the Netherlands seem to have a veto power within the IMF. And I think that is a disturbing aspect for the IMF, because Iceland is the first highly established democratic Western country that the IMF has dealt with for a number of decades. And to then make it apparent that other countries can play a power game of this scale within the IMF is not really good for the international financial cooperation.
Interestingly enough, Iceland had reshaped itself as the sort of financial powerhouse in more recent years. To what degree is the country having to rethink everything since the banking sector had this major problem? Is it heading back towards fisheries and technology to a greater degree?
Well, that is a very good point, that there is a certain inherent danger in making the financial sector too big, whether it is in Britain, United States, or in my country. Not just because it can fail and collapse like happened in Iceland, but also, as we discovered, it can prevent many other sectors from realizing their full potential, because the banks, being so successful, were aggressively taking engineers, mathematicians, computer scientists, the best students and the most qualified people, offering them high salaries and bonuses.
Mr. President, I'm going to ask for a very quick answer to a question we had from a viewer that came in from Facebook, from Raleigh in North Carolina. A viewer wrote in from the USA saying, what future do you see for Iceland now, given this crisis?
I am very optimistic about the Icelandic future, because we are very rich in resources and very rich in the education and the talent of our people. We have enormous clean energy resources. We have one of the largest reservoirs of fresh water left in Europe, selling water to Saudi Arabia and the Middle East. We have a beautiful country which is attracting tourists. And also we have a fishing sector which is taking from the ocean in a responsible way fish stocks that are necessary for our health. So for a long-term view, we are fortunate to have a country that has all the opportunities to continue to be successful despite the present crisis, which have, by the way, offered us very valuable but costly lessons.
Mr. President, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for being with us. Now, don't forget, you can follow us on Facebook, where you can keep updated on the topics we're covering, and we invite you to post questions and comments for our show there, and of course give us some feedback on what we're doing. From me and the team, we'll see you next time.